Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another one of these Facebook live streams with myself, Sam Gregory, and I'm delighted to welcome this evening's guest. Adam, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Are you well?
I am. I'm a little toasty, as I
Yeah, it's
suspect
hot,
many of
isn't
us
it?
are out there. I take it you've been sweating away wherever you are.
Just about, yeah. I mean, it's often a little cooler up north, but not today as much.
No, it's very tropical. So, I mean, typical British thing. We always moan, don't we? So,
We do.
welcome along to everybody who's watching. As ever, it's fabulous for us to see where you are. So drop us a comment in the box and tell us where you might be watching /sweating /overheating from. And as usual, the plan will be tonight to walk through some images from a particular location where we run a Light and Land tour. And on this occasion, we're back in the Lake District, in fact, with Adam, looking at a few different areas to our very first talk, which was a number of weeks ago now. But I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get too heavily into this. A little bit of a reminder, whilst people are obviously joining us, and welcome all of those who are jumping on in the next moment or two. Coming up in the next few weeks, obviously tonight we have myself and Adam talking about the Lake District and his images from there. And we've got a really nice selection of things to talk about, from locations, technique things, and more ethical things actually to do with photography and editing as well. That's obviously tonight. Next week, I'm doing our pixel to print, the first one of those. So I'm going to walk you through an image from shooting it to printing it live. What could possibly go wrong? And the week after that, we have Astrid McGeechan back, taking us on a couple of city tours to Bruges and to York. However, let's get into it tonight. And thank you for all the comments that are coming in, everyone who's joining us, letting us know where you are. We really do appreciate those. We've got sultry Macclesfield, Hampshire, Ilkley, Fordingbridge, Blackpool, East Sussex, 32 degrees in Wiltshire. I feel like I'm doing a BBC weather report, so let's move on promptly. Adam, first up, let's talk a little bit about your love, it's probably fair to say, for the lakes and why you wanted to do a tour up there.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I mean, firstly, I think just to say hello to all those Light and Land clients, basically, because I've been involved for a couple of years now with Light and Land, but it still feels like I'm relatively new. So maybe some people haven't come across me before, so hello to you. But my love of the Lake District goes a long way back to, like many people, sort of childhood trips there with my parents, and then walking later on in life with my dad. And then grew up in North Yorkshire as well, so there's plenty of hills there. And then around my early 20s, moved down to London, where I joined the Metropolitan Police and spent about 10 years down there. And the whole time I was down there, as my kind of photography career was beginning, doing weddings and things like that, I found myself just, as time went on, pining for the hills. And I went on little trips now and again, but it's like the mountains were calling me, essentially. I then had the opportunity to move back up to Yorkshire, where I am now based in Leeds, which is quite centrally located, gives me really good access to the Lake District, and have just pretty much spent the last 5 or 6 years solidly shooting in the Lake District, rediscovering all those places from when I was younger. And obviously I make videos for YouTube and have featured a lot of my trips to the Lake District on my YouTube channel. So it's kind of just rolled on from there. And then I did my first Light and Land tour of the Lake District last year, the year before, I lose track, but this image was one I took on that first tour. So it's always been a big part of my life, really, and continues to be.
Yeah, and I think, like a lot of people, when you have a yearning for those sorts of places, you have to make your way back. And the Lake District is obviously a very popular spot, but I think, and what we're going to see in some of these images, is there are great examples of capturing the beauty that we all know there. And there's some lovely images which are a little bit more, not abstract, it's not necessarily the right word, but they're a little bit less of the place. And so there's a really nice mix, and I'm really looking forward to getting into those with you tonight. And as I say, everyone, if you have any queries throughout this evening, Adam is absolutely happy to answer any questions to do with locations, to do with the particular images, the techniques, the processing, or even the more emotive side of things and his motivations there. So do pop them in, and I will, as always, keep my eye on the comments box, and I'll throw those at Adam as and when they come through. But Adam, let's get into this first image, and if you can just set the scene for us a little bit of where we are and your motivations here.
So this is the Borrowdale Valley with, I think that is either Blencathra or Skiddaw in the distance, which is one of the mountains or two of the mountains surrounding Derwent Water in the Lake District. This one was shot on the tour I was talking about. This was the sunrise. I think the first morning of my very first Light and Land tour. So I felt
bingo
reasonably happy with that, yeah. And we were staying, or the hotel was about 5 to 10 minutes walk away. And the tour that I'm doing with Charlie in October, we're staying in the same hotel. So I'm hoping we get similar conditions to this. Motivation-wise, I've got to be honest, my thinking at the time was helping out the clients to get their shot. So I just very quickly stuck my camera on the tripod with a 7200 lens to make the most of those reflections, because I mean, you can see on this image there's quite a gap between, there's a sort of slight gap in the middle before you get the pink sky in the distance, and I wanted to kind of compress as much of that into the frame as possible. So I went with a slightly longer lens to use those trees as well as the kind of mid-ground. There wasn't too much thought went into it other than to put those elements together into the frame as I was trying to help clients out. But it worked. I'm really happy with how it turned out.
I mean, one of the things we're going to talk about as well as we go through this is the fact that, and it's something that has come up in some of the other talks when, you know, specifically we've been talking to Ben Graham in Slovenia and myself to a degree in the Dolomites. Whenever you're in these sort of mountainous regions, you do get a great deal of different conditions throughout the day. So, I mean, commonly a lot of landscape is focused around sunrise and sunset, and when you get these sorts of colors, you can see why. But there are other things going on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we're going to get into that a little bit here. So, just from an accessibility point of view, obviously, some people who may be thinking of coming on a trip up there, it can be it can feel like there's a lot of walking to be done, but this sort of scene is presumably not a million miles away from where you stay.
No, it's about 10 minutes walk. However, I don't think this won't be the case in October. I wouldn't have thought, but when I went there in January, it was very wet, and where I was stood for this picture was underwater. But there's no doubt in my mind it'll be like that. That was after that very heavy stage of rain we had in January, I think. But one interesting point, I think, is I've had a discussion with a couple of the other Light and Land leaders before, whether they shoot or not whilst leading a tour. And I've come across a couple of different opinions, but I certainly do try to shoot, not to the detriment of the clients, but I think a lot of the time people are interested to see how you go about things. And that was one occasion here, as I had a couple of the clients with me as I was explaining what I was doing. And that was certainly the case here.
That can be a very useful thing, can't it? And I always, to throw my two penneth in on this, I remember saying to someone once, you know, if you booked on a weekend to go on a cooking course with Gordon Ramsay, you'd want him to get his knives out and do some cutting and do some cooking, right? And so sometimes people need a bit of help finding a composition to start with, even or even just seeing how you work, like you say, and you know, conversations can spark off each other there. I'm just going to move us on to the next image because we've got a good number to get through tonight, and this is a nice contrast because from our little chat earlier, I believe this was not a million miles in time and location from our first shot, but quite a different mood.
Yeah, so I mean that we're now an hour or two maybe after sunrise, which was that previous picture. We've gone a little bit further around the lake to the lakeside there, and yeah, it's the same morning, and there was a little bit more thought went into this one. All the clients had spent a little bit of time in the landscape by that point, so were off doing their thing. So I had a little bit more time to actually think about what was going on here. And I had this kind of picture in mind when I took it. I've called this one Curiosity, and I've spent a lot of time recently on my YouTube channel talking about curiosity, because I think it is one of the most important human traits that we have. Essentially, it drives so much of what we do. It's like when we go back to being sort of prehistoric and we lived in caves and things, it was like people used to wonder what's over that mountain, when we literally had no idea. So you had to go over the mountain to find out, that kind of adventurous side of things. But there's a sense of curiosity that gets beaten out of us as we're young. But I think to be creative, and for a lot of people who get into photography who rediscover a sense of creativity, I think to explore and rediscover your curiosity it goes hand in hand with that. What I like about this picture is that if you just glance at it very quickly, it feels very soft. It's just kind of, it's almost monochromatic, the kind of blue and white. But as you study it a little bit and look through that mist, there's just a little bit more going on. And as I left the police, having seen some pretty horrific things, and often used to do landscape photography as an escape, that allowed me, or my time in the police helped me kind of build up this philosophy that I spend time talking about as well on my YouTube channel. And I always try to feed that back into the pictures I create. And I think that's another point of being creative, is to use your own experience basically to try and feed that into your work as much as you possibly can. And it's harder with landscape actually a lot of the time than it is with other genres of photography, I think. So
well, yeah, I suppose you have there's moving elements that we can't control, you know, from a lighting point of view and from a condition point of view. But is it fair to say then that you actively seek and enjoy these sorts of conditions where there's that ambiguity and that element of subterfuge, as it were, that you can use visually?
Yeah, absolutely. I like these kind of soft light conditions. It was a very still morning, hence that mist and the slightly smoother water, although this is a long exposure. But I like those tones, and I often put a slight blue tint on them in post-production. I mean, this isn't a monochromatic image. It's not just a blue tint I put on a black and white image. It is a color image, but those conditions do appeal to me. Partly as well, I think it's just a little bit of belligerence as well, because these images don't necessarily do very well on Instagram and online, because they don't have that instant wow factor. But when you print images like this and you get all that detail into a fairly large print, I find them much more intriguing. It's those images that force you to look for more than just a few seconds. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. And I think in these days where there are a lot of images around and there's lots of shouty images which have their time and have their moment, as we all know, but something where you can just relax into it a little and find different things in it each time. It's a bit like having a really nuanced glass of wine, Adam. Trust me.
I was gonna say it's like the wallflower at a party. They're often the most interesting people there, aren't they?
Yes, yeah, and the guy doing all the prancing and dancing in the middle. Yeah, once you've seen it all.
Yeah, that's it. It's all over, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, who knew we were going to get into dancing? But it's only a quarter of an hour in as well. So no, I really enjoy this, and you know, the recession through the frame because of these, the way that the mist is just allowing that diffusion there is a nice thing to play with. And I think again, balance. You know, we talk about balance in some of these evening talks, and balancing the top and the water amount here is so. There's things visually going on which Adam's done, which will calm you, plus the coloration, plus everything else. So it all adds together to give that effect. I'm going to just keep us moving, Adam, just for time reasons. And I'm sorry, everyone, if you do have queries on specific ones as we go, as I say, ping them in the comments and I'll try and pick them up. Moving to this image, we have still some of that feeling of space. I think that's another thing we didn't really say about the last one, but which is definitely true here. We like, presumably, our eye to wander into that space. But tell us a little bit about this and some of the things you may have done to help encourage that feeling.
So this was a shot from the same location, about 200 meters probably further along the shoreline, but a completely different day. So I mean, they're not obviously unique conditions. It was raining on this occasion, though. It was a little bit windier. This is a long exposure image of about 2 seconds, I believe. The reason I wanted to do that from a technical point of view was because I wanted to create some separation for that tree to pop out of the image, for it to be part or the main subject essentially of that image. And at the time there was a lot of ripples in the water, and the faster frame, the normal frame as it were, the tree got lost in the contrast of the ripples. So that 2 second long exposure has just allowed me to smooth that water out and provide some separation from the water for that quite interesting tree, which normally would not be under the water, but because there'd been so much rain, it was on this occasion. It just made this image work. But I wanted to keep the detail in the cloud, which I think I've done to some extent, although it was still, it's rain rather than mist that you can see there in the distance. But I mean, looking at this image, well, it's one of those times when people often say, or as leaders or people that run workshops, they'll say to clients, slow down. And I mean, you hear that a lot. And I was thinking about that the other day, and when I was thinking about a possible subject for a video, and I was thinking, what does that even mean, really? So that was a question I was posing to myself, because I've said it as well. And I think for me, it means two things. The first one is it's about getting in touch with the landscape to some extent and spending some time in the landscape. That's what I try to encourage on my tours. It's not just a case of jumping off the bus, grabbing a shot and getting back on again. It's about giving people time to be in the landscape, to get a feel for it, to understand the relationships between things like the tree here and the background mountains and the water, and how you want to marry those things together into an image. I think that's important to then give people, as much as we're teaching, we're also giving people the space and time to come up with these ideas for themselves. But then I think the second thing, in terms of when we talk more about the technical aspects and advising people to slow down, I think that becomes about workflow. And this is something I've been talking about more recently, is just going through that same workflow, because it's something I find people struggle with more so than anything else. Just simple things like setting your tripod up, putting your camera on the tripod, then thinking about even thinking about the composition before you even do that. I think it's just as you practice that workflow and try and do the same routine over and over again, it reduces the concern about those technical issues and lets you maybe think more artistically. And that's particularly true with long exposures like this one, where we're taking an initial normal frame, then we add the filter and we do the long exposure. I mean, in this case, I was using a 6-stop filter, so the camera sees through that much easier. But that's if we go any longer or we use a 10-stop or a 16-stop filter, that's workflow becomes absolutely vital. And I think that's when we talk about slowing down, that's certainly what that means for me.
Yeah. And I think all excellent points, Adam. I think the great thing about what you said even at the beginning of that was understanding why you might use a certain technique to bring something to the image. So understanding that longer exposure is going to help with that definition and smooth that water out, so you don't have that crunch of contrast between the ripples in the water and the tree.
Absolutely. And that's coming for me. I mean, that's coming from just years of making mistakes, basically. So when I first discovered long exposure, and I was talking to Charlie Waite about this as well, I was very guilty of just thinking, right, I'm going to find a nice looking scene and I'm going to turn up and I'm going to take a better picture just by doing a long exposure. And that was my kind of theory for a good couple of years, I think, before I started to realize these long exposure images don't always look better. So I think if I'd done this for, say, 30 seconds or a minute or even a little bit longer, that I would have completely lost that balance that you were talking about in the previous image, because the clouds would have just become completely smoothed out, and it just would have been a tonal thing rather than a texture or detail thing, and it wouldn't have worked as well, I don't think.
Yeah. A quick question. Adriano has sent this in, and forgive me, Adriano, I'm not sure if he's talking about this image or the one before, because the question came just as I flicked him over, but this is stunning. Thank you on behalf of Adam. Did you try to convert it to monochrome for comparison?
No, because I had the idea in my head. I've got and it's building a series of images, as you can see from that previous one, in these moody kind of conditions, using this slightly blue tint. And the project is growing as we speak, as I try to get similar types of conditions and similar blue tonal images across as many of the national parks in the UK as I can possibly get. So I haven't put a time limit on how long that project will be, but it is growing somewhat successfully, with mistakes here and there. But so no, I didn't. To answer that question, I didn't ever consider turning this one black and white.
Yeah, and there's a good, nice, interesting point we could go into there about bodies of work, but now and tonight may not be the time for it, but we could do something on that in the future, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I wanted to. We've got 2 or 3 panoramic shots, and we did want to put these in. But it's great because we've not had, off the top of my head, we've not had any. Maybe we've had one panoramics in these previous weekly chats that we've been doing in all these virtual tours, and so we wanted to talk a little bit about maybe the whys and the whens of when you might choose to do this would be an interesting one to ask you, Adam, and also maybe a little bit of the technique, because I think it might be something that people maybe fret about a little bit and worry they don't have the right equipment for. So it'd be really interesting to know your processes for doing these. So first up, why did you choose to do it in this particular scenario, and when might that also be something you would consider?
My decision to do a panorama usually comes down to the point where I'm stood in a scene where there's a classic view. So something that where you stood in front of it, it has that feeling of awe or amazement. Usually in those scenes, I will stand there, try and absorb the location like I was talking about earlier, and then pick out the composition, whether that's something a bit tighter in with a longer lens, or I find a wider shot with some interesting foreground. Sometimes that doesn't quite work. So for me, I mean, it's a little bit of a case of almost resorting to a panorama. Not all the time, because it might be that you've got an idea of what you want it to look like, but I will generally just try and capture the scene that I'm looking with a panorama, which probably leads to the fact that I'm not always that successful with them. Because there isn't as much thought put into the composition, but I also see them I try to have a connection from left to right or right to left much more than you do kind of vertically, maybe. But yeah, I mean, from the technical point of view, I take quite a lot of heat for the way I shoot panoramas, because normally I will just have one of my lenses, either the wider angle, sort of 16 to 35, or a 24 to 70. I just pop it on my tripod with a ball head, and I shoot it vertically to get as much resolution as possible. And I'll just pull the ball head down to the side of the tripod. I don't use an L bracket or anything like that for video reasons more so than anything else. But I then just spin if I do it on the tripod, I will just spin it round on the tripod, and I take a lot of heat from people who watch my videos saying, "What about parallax shift, where you're not rotating around that single axis? It's kind of off axis, so you can get a thing called parallax shift." It's not even worth thinking about, really, to be honest. I don't think, but especially when it's a distance scene like this one, I don't find that it becomes an issue. And my response, as people tell me the best way to do a panorama is to use an L bracket with it on the top, I'll often disagree and say, actually, no, the best way is how I captured this one, and that's to use a tilt shift lens using that shift function. So maybe you won't get quite as high a resolution, but how often do we need those massive resolution panoramas? This one, I think it's either 5 or 3 pictures. I can't remember. So with a tilt shift lens, you can just line up your composition and then you rotate the shift and it shifts it sideways, and you can just capture the shot perfectly. And with that tilt shift lens, because it's shifting it in relation to the sensor, you then, when you come to stitch them together in post, they stitch together perfectly. And this one and the next one, I've used that shift function. And what that often lets you do as well is it prevents any distortion, which if we move on to the next picture of the stones, this scene here, which is very accessible actually, it's one we'll be visiting in October, there's no doubt. It's actually quite a difficult scene to shoot, because if you use a normal lens, you do get a tiny little bit of distortion. I mean, you can now correct that with a bit of skew in post and things like that, but with a tilt shift lens, you don't need to. Also, to shoot this scene, you need to get as high as possible, I think, to see the stones in the background, because it's actually, the stone circle is on the peak of a hill. And normally I'd probably shoot it from the other side, but on this occasion, I liked the snow in the background and I liked the light from that side as well. I thought that worked quite well for the image. But yeah, I mean, it's a classic shot if you're in that location.
Yes, it's very, very of the area, isn't it? Just for those of you watching live, we did just put up our first poll of the evening, which was whether you're confident shooting panoramic images, because I was interested to know how many of you are and how many aren't, because obviously Adam and I, have seen people out and about, and we do get asked about things. And interestingly, Adam, 52% of people on the poll do not feel confident shooting panoramic images, compared to 48% who do. And that may well be due to some of that technique stuff that we've talked about, and maybe they feel I don't have all the gear. And what is interesting is I know sometimes, and excuse me, thank you for those who voted on that, who can see that live. Sometimes you can handhold these days with even the Lightroom panoramic stitching is pretty good. I know some people fear they have to go into lots of different technical things, but handholding is perfectly possible, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If we move on to the next one, that is from the top of a mountain called Great End. And we're looking again, that's Great Gable, that one that's just off center, if you're aware of any of the mountains in the Lake District. But this was a sunrise, sun obviously off to the right there. And I did this one handheld. I can't remember what lens I used. It's probably a 24-70, I would imagine. No, 70 to 200. So I must have been at 70 millimeters for that one. And that's just a case. So the trick is when you're doing panoramic handheld shots, is firstly to be in manual mode. So because you don't want your exposure to shift as you go across the panorama, you want to really expose for the brightest part of the image. So you don't expose for the shadowy area across to the left and then end up in the area towards the right of this image overexposed. So I've exposed across to the right hand side, but then I'll normally start over to the left because I just prefer going from left to right. I'll then just use the grid within my viewfinder and then just overlap a third. So when I do them handheld, it usually ends up being about 12 images stitched together vertically. And I think part of the trick is to get it as steady as possible, is to point your feet where you're going to finish, and then sort of twist your hips back towards the start. And then as you start to shoot, your body will naturally just come back to where your feet are, and you'll get a nice smooth panorama. And then these days, as you put that into Lightroom, you can now use the thing where you just drag the slider and it fills out the corners anyway. Excuse me. And in a mountainous scene like this, that works really well because often there isn't fine detail in the extremities of your image. So as you skew it automatically in Lightroom, it actually fills it out really nicely. So you don't necessarily lose any resolution.
Yeah, and I think these a couple of comments, Diane saying, ignore any criticism. Whatever way you get the panoramas, they certainly work. Too many critics who say there's only one way to do anything. Yeah, I'm sure we've all seen those people on the internet. And some love coming in for your stone circle, Adam. I think one thing I wanted to pick up on, just final point on the panoramas, and then we'll move on. They do give this great sense of scale because of the nature of the format, and especially when you have huge elements to play with, be it mountains and things like that. It's a great way just to think about shooting something a little bit differently once you may have done what you're doing. Think about, could you show that grandeur, that scale, and would this be one way to think about doing it? But as we move on from there, we just wanted to sneak this one in, Adam, because I know you have spent some time up on the fells tucked away. So is that still something you try and get out and do?
Absolutely. I mean, I haven't been to the Lake District since the lockdown, but I'm going to be going back very soon, and it will probably look something like this. This was the night before that image, the last panoramic image we just saw there. It was a beautiful evening, and I wanted to show this just to give an idea of how it is sometimes in these moments. There wasn't much wind. It's just inspired. It's this kind of thing that inspires me in the mountains. As you get the opportunity to wake up with that view, the cost is a physical expense rather than a monetary one. But the rewards just outweigh the hardship that you have to go through to get up to there, especially carrying a load of photography gear and camping gear. I do sometimes question myself as to why I'm lugging up 20 kilograms worth of glass and metal, but it usually, like on this occasion, it usually pays off.
Yeah, and I think when you have that connection to the place, the images will come. I'm going to just keep us honest for time reasons, but we wanted to put this one in because this is a very famous location. So maybe if you can let us know where we are, and also, some of the challenges maybe, especially with yourself. I know with the YouTube channel First Man Photography, for anyone who doesn't know, do check that out. There can be challenges to shooting very iconic locations, but how do you feel generally about
that? I'm very comfortable with it, and I've shot several, because apart from anything, maybe as you try to make a little bit of money from your landscape photography, a lot of non-photographers will not have seen these places before, and they do make for really nice, impressive images, because the scene, sometimes you might get a scene that the composition just comes very naturally to a half decent photographer. So you might end up with a lot of images looking the same, but from your own personal point of view, I just want to bag those pictures. So I think last time we were together, you were telling me about the Dorset coast, and I went to Durdle Door and shot that for the first time. And I've seen that picture a million times, but I'm really pleased that I've bagged that for myself, and I've been there to see it myself. So I don't get on my high horse at all about shooting iconic locations. I think actually you can learn a lot from it. And I talk a lot about, on videos and on the workshops, about the learning process. So for example, when you are learning to play the piano or a musical instrument, the first thing you do is play a song by somebody else, and you imitate those people that you love and respect as artists. And I don't think photography needs to be any different. And we then go from that imitation phase as our experience builds, and we start to innovate a little bit, and we put our own ideas into it. And that's kind of what I've tried to do with this one. It's at Bleat Tarn in the Lake District, so it's a very famous location. Again, one we will probably visit in October. It's very accessible. There's a car park, 10 minutes, 5 minutes walk from this spot. The normal scene you might see of this one is with the Langdale Mountains in the background. That's not that mountain there. So I wanted to just kind of move around the tarn a little bit to get a slightly different view of Side Pike, that little hill is called there. And I just loved the light coming in from the side that's hitting that tree, particularly the green tree. I really like that one. I feel like it balances the image out a little bit and sets off that against the mountain in the distance. But I think when you go to these iconic locations, there's always something else to shoot as well. So you can bag the classic shot, turn around, go 90 degrees left, go 90 degrees right, and there's always something else to see. You can put a longer lens on to see if you can pull something out of that iconic location. And some of that was what I was trying to do here, I guess.
Yeah. And as Adam mentioned, Bleetarn is fairly accessible, which is nice, and there are still lots of different ways to deal with it. And actually, at the time of year they're going to be there in October, you're just starting to find some of that color coming in autumnally as well, which is a great thing to play with, and those contrasts of colors. I am going to move us on, Adam, just because there's a couple of nice topics we want to get into with a bit of time for later. We've seen a couple of earlier images in the talk tonight about, much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Cooler, calmer, more soothing. However, it's always about reacting to the conditions. And as we've mentioned in Lakeland and in any sort of mountainous places, you do get, different weather coming in at you. And here in these next couple of images, we have a little bit more of mean and moody, should we say. So are you equally as happy when the rain's flying in and that there's this drama and atmosphere to play with in the images?
To be honest, so sometimes more happy, because as a landscape photographer, we're often we're seeking solitude. Maybe I know that's certainly the case for me. Although I do like going out with other people as well, but solitude is something I look for, and you're almost guaranteed that on a day when it's raining. And I'm a big proponent of going out in bad weather, because if you've got the right clothing and a little bit of experience, then you can do it very safely, and you can come away with some very interesting images, particularly as the weather changes, either from worse weather, as it were, bad weather, not that I think it's bad, but for lack of a better word, to good weather. You get those dramatic changes in the light, and that's something that appeals to me. But then sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you're trying to make the best of lesser lighting conditions, or flatter light, shall we say. That's definitely the case here. I was dealing with some rain coming towards me. I think you can see the wind to some extent on the tarn itself. That's Haweswater Reservoir in the distance. And this was the image that I used to create one of my presets, which I call the bad weather preset. I created it a year or two ago now. And the emphasis of the preset was to marry the feeling I have when I'm stood there to the image, to the raw file that I'm dealt with. Because if you look at the raw file for this one, it would be very grey. But grey isn't necessarily something I feel is necessarily a bad thing. And I think when I'm studying these grey conditions, it often feels more vibrant to me than just plain grey. So that's why with this preset, it's always bringing in a slightly bluer tinge. And I mean, if you look towards the top left of the image, there is actually a tiny bit of blue sky in there anyway. But and then I try to then accentuate in post-production and with the preset, try to accentuate some of the shadows and add more contrast than normal, and then also put a radial filter over the subject of the image, just to give it that kind of that mood across the image, and high contrast from the darker areas to the brighter areas. And I mean, personally, I really like it, but I know some people are not as keen, but I'm always trying to make the best of any condition I can get, really.
Yeah.
Because I like being outside.
Yeah, ditto. For those who are watching live again, we've got another one of our little polls just running. If depending on your device, you'll be able to see that just pop up on the screen. And the question is, do you use processing presets or post-processing presets? I haven't quite got my teeth in for that tonight. But it was interesting because sometimes that can be good, sometimes that can be bad, and we might talk about that a little bit more. There's another image where we're going to kind of mention the preset side of things, but I think for a lot of people, once they start to learn those, it's a bit like learning spices. As long as you know why you're throwing that into the dish, then it's absolutely a good way to think about it sometimes. And actually, just from the quick results that are coming in now, thank you, vast majority do not use presets, and maybe there's a conversation about that one day, about maybe why people don't, if they have worries about it, etc. Adam, I may ask you that a bit more in a couple of images time if I can.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
But I'm just going to show the results on that one and we'll keep it moving. This is the one we picked out to use as the kind of the header image, and you did mention it a little bit at the top of the chat, but can you just, I know where we are, but if you, for the viewers' sake, can you let us know where we are and some of the appeal of that particular location, which generally is a bit quieter in my experience?
It is, and it's also one of the most impressive places in England at the very least. I think it's Westwater in the Western Lake District. I think the reason it's more quiet often is because it's slightly harder to access in terms of getting to it from the main road. It takes quite a while to get round to that spot, and then you've got a long winding road to get to this location. And even once people are there, you can be quite spread out and still experience this location. It's definitely one I think we'll visit in October if people are up for going round that far. But it's so impressive when you're there. It's like it feels you're surrounded by mountains basically, apart from behind you. But as you look in this direction, it's literally one of those places that people talk about in the Lake District where you can point your camera in any direction and come out with something half decent. I mean, that's absolutely true of this location. This was taken on the tour. So, yeah, I mean, I've used the same preset actually for this one as well. So with slightly different tweaks.
I was just going to say, with a little bit of my pointer, I got my annotator, Adam, and I love it once I start on that. There's lots of lovely lines that are very similar here and drawing you all the way through it. And whenever I think you get these V shapes in the mountains, as you've done very successfully on quite a number of these images, it allows you that way to draw people in, right? You know, and when you're there, you sort of feel it because the mountains are around you. But this particular area, just before we move on, there's a lot of foreground elements, there's a lot of rocks, and so it's about finding the right thing, isn't it? And not just thinking, oh, I need a foreground element. It's if something works and anchors the image successfully to build that in.
Yeah, I mean, this one particularly, it's like a little island in the middle of the lake that you can get to going over some very dodgy stepping stones. And one of the clients wanted to go across there. So I was a little bit worried for his safety. So I followed him just in case he got into trouble. But we both got there safely. And this was one of the images I managed to capture. Again, it's a slightly long exposure. I just wanted to... Part of the reason I will do a long exposure sometimes now, again, it's not that long because you can still see the detail in the sky. But talking about the lines you're talking about, both in the background and in the foreground, I didn't want any distractions in the midground as much. And actually the length of the exposure that I've got almost continues those lines in the detail in the water that is still there.
Yeah, it draws it.
Yeah, and I think I probably also used the polarizer on that one just to get the detail of the rock at the bottom right hand side, just to see through, to take the sheen off the water, to see through the water a bit, to maintain that foreground interest.
Yeah, it's a great shot and very evocative of the place. We've just changing tack really visually here, and this is I really love this for lots of reasons, but I want to know your thoughts about it, Adam, rather than mine.
I mean, there's two parts to this image actually, because the first part or the second part rather, I talked about in a video not so long ago, which I talked about a feeling of feeling a bit worthless and a feeling of imposter syndrome that comes often as part of that, because this image was included or latterly included in the Light and Land Evolving Exhibitions, or Evolving Landscape exhibition. Yeah, thank you. And so I sent it to Charlie Waite. He printed it, sent it back to me to be signed and things like that. And then it ended up in Joe Cornish's gallery. And I was thinking, how have I come to this as a photographer? I've got no idea how this happened really, other than working quite hard. So this image actually means quite a lot to me for that bit after I made it. But also the thoughts around making of it was that it was shot during a cloud inversion. So in the Lake District and many places where you get these bodies of water, that normally where the clouds will be above because of the temperature and the air pressure, that kind of flicks round in certain conditions. So you end up with the cloud being on the surface, trapped by the air above it as a different temperature. And if you have a mountainous place, you can climb up the mountain and get above that cloud and look down on it. So you've got blue sky above you and cloud below you. So on this occasion, it's at the top of Waller Crag, and this is at one of the islands in Derwent Water. So I had your classic view, your classic wide view, mountain scene, lakes, mountains in the distance, and a cloud inversion. But so I did take that shot, but it's not the one I preferred, because as I was watching the cloud develop as the morning went on, this island started to just find a tiny little gap in the cloud as the cloud started to disperse a little bit. And that's often the best point when you're shooting cloud inversions, if you're lucky enough to see one. But this gap in the cloud opened up, and that island originally just kind of started to appear. And my instant reaction was just to pop it right in the middle of the frame, almost like a portrait or something. But then I thought, well, I feel like it's going to work better off down towards the corner a little bit, as I've placed it here, to increase, I guess, to some extent, that sense of scale, because you can see more of the cloud across the rest of the image. And it also just provides that extra bit of negative space, essentially, which then just from the top left side pushes your attention back onto that island. And I was lucky enough to have some of those autumnal colours in there as well. So, I mean, I don't think I'll be lucky enough to see that scene again. So I was just very pleased that I'd put the effort in to drive 3 hours, hike up in the dark, and then be in position for this. And people call it luck sometimes, but maybe there's an element of that. But you've got to be there, haven't you, to get these moments.
It's funny how the luck tends to happen when the work's gone in beforehand as well.
Exactly.
But we wanted to get into this particular image just to kind of raise a little point, which is a bit of a hot potato, which is good. We can talk about it, to do with kind of ethics of editing. And sometimes I wonder when we do some of these talks, and I'm even wondering about next week, showing people through some of my processes, we let people behind the curtain to a degree. But Adam, I know that you picked this image on purpose because there was a particular something you did in it, and we just wanted to talk about that and the thoughts around it. Yeah.
So, I mean, I talked about this on a video a little while ago because I'm interested in the ethics, because especially now as we've got the vast number of images going onto Instagram, you're wondering, as the viewer of a landscape image, the natural assumption, and particularly with photography anyway, is that it's real and that that's a photograph of what you could actually see. And we all know now that images can be manipulated, but I want to know going into that what that image is. And I think part of that comes from my time in the police as well, where as you study criminal law, intent is a vital part of criminal law. The intent of the criminal, as it were, is that state of mind has a big part on the crime, and especially and particularly the punishment as well. And so I think the intent of the photographer is important. So it's not to say that a landscape photograph is any worse or better than what you might describe as digital art, or something that's slightly more generated in the computer, as it were. It's not, one thing is not, I don't think one thing's better than the other necessarily. I know which I prefer, but I think the intention of the person creating that image should be clear. So I don't want to be tricked, basically. I don't want to be tricked into thinking that an image is real when it's not, because I like to look at a landscape picture, get a nice sense of what maybe the photographer was feeling, or I want to imagine myself being there. And I would hate to get to this location, for example, and realize this particular image is not possible, which it isn't. This is a little tarn at the top of Loughrig Fell, which is near Ambleside in the Lake District. And this little tree has fallen off this little island at some point and is still alive, I think, in the middle of this tarn. The roots still must be in there. But this was the image I wanted to create. But when I got onto a slightly raised position, I put a longer lens on there and I zoomed in, trying to frame it like this, but it wasn't possible because I ended up with the bank of the tarn across the top of the image. So I removed that in post-production, essentially adding water to the tarn with the content aware fill. I'm not particularly good in Photoshop, but I think I've done a pretty good job on here. So I don't think you can see it at all where I've made those edits, and you would never know, I don't think, unless I told you with this one. And I think that's why I used this image to sort of raise that question about ethics and whether a photograph is fake or not. And there's obviously been some high-profile ones over the years. With the National Geographic one is a famous one, and then the cloud behind the moon as well is a more recent one. And it's just, I think that the intent of the photographer and whether they're trying to trick people, and I think it's just an interesting. I don't have any answers. I'm just kind of interested in the questions, really.
Yeah,
I personally, I don't want to be tricked.
Yeah, I think it is a difficult one. Not because of fear of upsetting anyone, but there's sort of gradations of grey as to where we feel comfortable, putting things. And obviously, competitions have set rules and everything else. But it's one of those things that we probably automatically, like you said, feel most of what we're seeing is right. But there's lots of reasons for that, and how we've been taught to think about photography, and seeing, I'll believe it when I see it, the proof's in the pudding, and show me that, it's all been used for that purpose. But interestingly, I've put the post up there saying, would you remove a large element in post-processing? That's the poll that I've just put up for those of you that are watching live. And so far, 62% have said yes, they would remove, they'd be comfortable removing a large element in post-processing. So this is probably a big conversation for another day when we're not sort of 8 minutes from the end. But I think it's an interesting one to go away and think about. And I'm glad Adam was happy to put one in and sort of raise the question.
Yeah, like I said, there's no right or wrong. Like it's obviously subjective and artistic, and you're trying to realize your vision. But like I say, I don't want to be left feeling tricked.
No.
That's all.
Okay, cool. I've done a terrible job with this, Adam, mate, keeping us on time. So I'm sorry. We'll rattle through a few of these at the end. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us through this. We know it's very hot inside. We do appreciate you giving us the time. We wanted to just put this in because this is a tricky technical shot to make because of that huge dynamic range, Adam. And so have you had challenges with this and coming back to it?
Yeah, I've come back to this one quite a few times over the years. I took it probably about 5 or 6 years ago. I actually wanted to get the sunset, but it's quite a long walk to that position, and to get back, I was walking down towards that tarn and then back along kind of the line of that stream that goes off towards the bottom right of the image. And I didn't dare stay out and walk back in the dark. So I was a bit nervous, but I have done that. But the high dynamic range in this image, because it was slightly earlier in the day, has always been the challenge. But I really love the image because I'm happy with the composition, with the rock kind of anchoring you to the left, and then the stream and the lines of the rock kind of bringing you up from the bottom right up to that tarn sort of in the middle of the image, and then you've got that light coming through the clouds towards the top right. So I really love the image, but it's just I'm still not happy with it to this day because of the way I've edited it, and I've tried processing it in various different ways, and I'm struggling with the shadow area towards the bottom right, because like you said earlier, if that was in much darker shadow, it would be a really large block of dark area in the image, which would unbalance it, especially as you've got that much brighter area above it. So I've raised those shadows obviously quite a lot. And then you get that decoloration a little bit when you do that. The original shot was very green, so in this edit, I've pulled a lot of the green out. Actually, it's made it slightly better with some of the recent updates to Lightroom, where you can now make hue adjustments in the brush adjustments and gradient adjustments. That's made it slightly better. It allowed me to adjust the color of the rays back to what they looked like, rather than being a bit more orangey, which they were before. But
so Adam, sorry mate, quick question just on this before we move on. Was this a single exposure or did you bracket?
Let me just.
Well,
no,
Adam,
that is a single. That's a single image. Oh no, sorry, that is a HDR. Yeah, that's bracketed. Yeah.
Okay, so yes, Peter, that question was from you. And even when you do capture all that data, there's still balancing it, as we've talked about there, with shadows and light. And maybe the takeaway is that don't be afraid to, if you're not quite sure about it, leave it, come back to it. You can come back to it multiple times sometimes.
Yeah, because whilst we say it's HDR, I'm not a fan of that HDR look. So I'm always just trying to use that extra dynamic range in a bracketed image to bring it back to what my eyes saw rather than what the camera saw.
Yeah. We just wanted to pop this one in because it was a kind of different vibe, and it touched on the preset thing. And actually, it's a black and white image, and everything we've been done is in color so far, isn't it, Adam?
Yes. Yeah.
So, do you shoot a great deal in black and white? How do you feel shooting in black and white?
I mean, I do really enjoy it, and it's something. If I'm going to shoot in black and white, I will try, especially as the years have gone on, I will try and make that decision at the time. Doesn't always work, and this is a good example of where that was the case. I didn't initially plan for this to be a black and white image, but as I've revisited this one, this is another preset that I've come up with, a kind of very contrasty black and white, and I think it's worked particularly well for this scene because we've got that high contrast anyway, with that light on the mountains towards the top right or the middle right, and then you've got the darker valley below.
Adam, can I just, sorry, one little thing just on the, and I know we're tight for time, and apologies everyone, I'll take the bullet for that. The question, a comment came in about the presets that obviously no two shots are the same and therefore they require different processing, but is it fair to say the preset you use is kind of a starting point that they then may be amended? Yeah,
absolutely. I think with my presets, they set a style, as it were, rather than a final edited image. Yeah, I mean, you never ever, very, very rarely will you be able to just click that preset and it'll be right. So with a lot of my presets, it's setting a style. So that includes contrast. It will often include color changes. So I've got a one that I use for a lot of woodland images that drag a lot of the green out to give it kind of a moody fantasy type feel to a woodland shot, and that just pulls green out. There's the application of other things like changing color, like I said, changing hue, and then doing split toning as well for the color images. And that allows you to just apply a style rather than a fine edited image. And like you say, it's a good starting point a lot of the time.
Yeah, to finesse on from there. We've just got 2 or 3 images left, and if Adam can give us 5 more minutes, that'd be great, and we'll finish that up. Everybody, thank you for staying with us through this. We just wanted to put this in because it's something we don't always think about with the lakes, but the sea is not far away, and here we're looking at it, Adam.
Yeah, I mean this is not one we will be visiting on the October tour, because we're at about 950 meters there. That was in January 2019, I think, possibly. It was about minus 10, 15 degrees. It was a beautiful evening and there was no wind whatsoever, which made that temperature okay to handle. If it had been windy, it would have been horrible, but it made it for very clear conditions, much cleaner than I've ever seen, really, I think, at that height. And what we're looking at there is the west coast from Great Gable. I don't know what that wind farm is, but if you can see, I don't know if it's good enough on your screen, but if you can see right into the distance there is another body, there's another land mass, and that's actually the Isle of Man. And when you look at it on a map, it's a good number of miles away. So I just found that quite interesting. And I like that. I like the colours as well.
And if we turn to our left, presumably, then we have our view the other way.
Yeah, I mean, the tripod is in exactly the same place. This is a little bit later, maybe 10, 15 minutes later, with a 90-degree turn to the left. Tripod in exactly the same place, same lens. And I like shots like this in the mountains, because you can play around with the shape and the lines of those mountains, create something a little bit more unique as you get in there with that 70-200 lens and get in a bit closer. And it gives you the opportunity in these big wide vistas to create something a little bit more unique. And I just like the lines in this one. I really like the soft tones on that rock in the foreground, and as we go up towards the icy peaks, and then obviously you've got that sort of magenta sky as well. And then after that, again, a very clear day, you can actually see the Yorkshire Mountains off towards the distance there on the left. Yeah.
It's a nice idea of what if you do manage to get up high, the distances you can see. We wanted to just finish on something quite traditional in a way, and sort of, when we talk about the lakes, it captures a lot of it for me, the dry stone walls, the lake, obviously. But there was a point as well, Adam, about, care for the landscape, and we wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite timely, I think, because this is a classic scene. It's not this sort of, I'm not the first person to take an image looking like this, but all the elements lend themselves to this composition. So it's not like I've copied anybody. It's just that all those elements are there, with the leading line of that wall, Windermere in the distance there, and then that style. And unfortunately, that style has now been destroyed. It was vandalized, and they have subsequently not replaced it. So that shot with that style is now not possible. So I'm quite happy to have this image. They've just replaced it by removing the wood and putting a couple of stones that stick out there. And as we have seen, and it's been nice over the lockdown period and the pandemic period, seeing so many new people connecting with the landscape and getting outdoors, and hopefully some of them have discovered landscape photography as well. But there's a couple of caveats that go along with that. I think firstly, something I tweeted about a day or two ago is that the outdoors can be dangerous. Like if you're new to it and you're getting up particularly if you're getting up into the mountains, they can be dangerous, particularly if you don't have the right clothing, particularly if it's cold. And we've seen a large number of call outs for mountain rescue and the Coast Guard as well at the seaside. So it's just about respecting the landscape and then respecting the countryside as well, and the people that work in the countryside and live there. And it's just, I don't know why we talked about earlier, didn't we? I don't know why you'd destroy style at that point. It's just, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, yes, it's a very topical thing, and I think, yes, I love the fact that this is, it just says the lakes, and it's a working landscape. It is a working landscape for the people that are there,
Yeah.
not only for the tourism but for everything else that goes on in that area. And so, it's great to be able to sort of capture that in an image and remind ourselves to take care of those places.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great spot. It really is, and it's not. I mean, you do have to climb up a little bit, but it's not too bad. And as in terms of trying to finish on a positive note as well, it's again one of those. It's those moments that make it kind of all worthwhile when you're there. I think I had a mate with me that day, and we just stood there enjoying this scene, enjoying the sunset, and it just makes doing landscape photography and being outside and being out in the landscape all so worthwhile. And hopefully we can have a few of these moments in October with Charlie.
Yeah, great. And it's a great place to finish. Charlie Waite is joining Adam on this workshop, as I believe they did last year. And it's 6th to the 9th of October this year. And there are, I believe, just a couple of, a small number of places available, I think, last time I checked.
Yeah, we were sold out, but with as we had to postpone due to the pandemic and stuff, a few people couldn't do the rearranged date, so there's a couple of places left. But
yeah, so if you fancy a dash up to the lakes in October with two very experienced photographers who know the place very well, obviously, then that is well worth looking at. Adam, just before I wrap us up with what's coming up next week, great big thanks, mate, for spending the time with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening and watching, and thanks to you as well, Sam. Cheers.
No, you're welcome. And for anyone who doesn't already, check out Adam's YouTube channel, First Man Photography. So you go over there. There's lots of tutorials about how to, seeing Adam out in the field, printing, processing, all sorts of things, and some more philosophical things, should we say, sometimes about photography and care in the landscape. So do check that out. Final bit from me now is just to say thank you for joining us as always. It would be a great favor for us if you can just give the post a like and a share on your way out of here. Next week, I will be back doing something new for you, which is going to be a pixel to print session. We've picked out this image from the Dolomites, and I'm going to walk you through some thoughts around the composition at the time and a basic edit and workflow to literally then print one live in front of you on the night. And I'll be taking questions about the processes and everything else involved in that. So it would be very nice if you could join me next week for that one. But from us, thank you, good night, and we shall speak to you again very soon.
Cheers, bye.